Soul Growth. 29th December. Today we attended the big satsang at which there were about 90,000 present. The congregation sang hymns, as is customary before each satsang, and then a man with a superb voice, who had sung before the last two discourses, gave a hymn of his own composition, and as he had done on former occasions, one of Kabir's shabads. He sang with all the feeling he could muster, and with most fervent gestures. He had great histrionic power, and a magnificent voice with deep conviction behind it. Though most of us did not understand the language, we could quite easily follow what he was saying. It is customary at all satsangs for the master to be attended by two patis, chanters, who sit beside him on the dais. They sing in unison, couplets from sacred poems written by previous masters recognized as being of the highest order, those who have inculcated the sound current in their teachings as being the main means, through the instructions of a living master, of finding our way back to Sachkhand, the home of the spirit. After the chanting of each set of couplets, the master discourses on the subject, expanding its implication and drawing on parallels to underline its message. Satsangs are simple and straightforward, with the minimum of ceremony, in the idiom which simple country folk can understand, for they form the bulk of the master's audience. Some of the satsang I understood as follows. When you look at a tree, you realize it has sprung from a tiny seed, and here the master gestured with his beautiful and expressive hands to show its smallness. And the little plant has grown slowly, slowly into a shady and spreading giant of a tree, which, if you consider it, was all wrapped up in that small seed case waiting to be developed. But if you had been told beforehand that this little seed would develop into such a gigantic tree, you would never have believed it possible. In a like manner, the soul and the word are wrapped up within the body and mind of man, waiting to be developed by a true guru. He gave a vivid description of the descent of the soul from Sat Nam, first being caught in the lure of the mind and its handmaid Maya, which by means of the senses, behaving like a courtesan, drew it away from its true bright destiny, at first by beauty and diversity, and then, when this fragmentation was well advanced, by the blindness of ignorance and separation, until pain and bewilderment filled its days. It no longer had any knowledge of its origins by which to set its standards, and deluded by the tawdry alternatives offered by its new companions, it became bound down by the chain of action and reaction, which moment by moment grew longer and stronger. Instead of going within itself, he explained, it now grows an ego, and runs outward to possess all it sees around it, only tying itself tighter to its terrible surroundings, when all the while salvation is nearer to it than its own hands and feet. This ego, he continued, is the chief barrier we have to any chance of a return to our true surroundings. It finds expression in such language as my, I like this, I hate that, my wife, my children, my property. With this ego uppermost, we can never truly possess any of these things, nor attain the permanent happiness with which their possession seems ever to lure us. This can only be achieved when I and my are shed forever. Sometimes the soul becomes dimly aware of its predicament and tries to purify and redeem itself by living the life of an anchorite, or by practicing one of the dead, hollow, outward religions of this world in temple or mosque. Literally, our only hope is when, in human form, we find a guide who knows the way out of this maze and learn the technique from him of withdrawing our attention to the third eye. And here the master gestured again with his gentle hand to a spot between the eyes, where we will contact the pure music of the audible life stream, the source of life itself. We will slowly, by ardent and assiduous practice, learn to discriminate and begin to see, in some small measure, the path our Satguru is trying to show us. At first, due to the jangle of our worldly life, we cannot discern the full glory of the harmony within us. But it is there, just as surely as fire is latent in wood, which on being rubbed in the correct manner springs to life. The whole secret lies in devoting ourselves so wholeheartedly to our Master's instructions that we not only resemble him whom we love, but literally become him. Yes, I thought, this is what is meant by bhakti, true devotion. It is to love one's Master and all for which he stands so devotedly and tenaciously that all intervening material forces are dissolved and one automatically merges in him. This, then, is bhakti. Sachkhand is here, and only my will stands in the way. The worst foe becomes a friend, for by understanding him, I understand the motivation of all, and perceive the stillness and peace at the core of life. Seeing it, I cease to have need of I, and become thou and him. But the trouble is, I thought, that I cannot hold this idea in my mind all the time. I will get up from here, and the world will flood in, and the glory of this thought will be dissolved like sunlight in the little boy's jug. What can I do to keep it? Scarcely had I thought this when the Master's voice again reached my consciousness. Man himself is utterly helpless, like a feather blown by the wind, and is only given a sense of direction when God smiles on him. We are all beggars at his door, and only by continually begging can we obtain his grace. And then in his compassion he will hear and give us all. Only by continually exercising the spirit will I strengthen it, I thought. Like every other activity in this life, strength comes through practice. At least 2.5 hours of bhajan a day, he has said on many occasions. It all comes back to the Master. Only he can give me the tenacity of purpose, the bhakti, to carry this out. After satsang, we again had the blessing of darshan for 5 or 10 minutes, as there was much for Maharaji to do, with the vast crowds requiring his attention. Some of our members went again to see the food blessed in the langar. After lunch we were hurriedly summoned to watch seva being done by thousands of satsangis. We saw earth being carried from the inner dunes of the river and thrown into the huge ravine-like depressions that run down to its bed, in order that a road may be built from the guest house to complete a circuit of the dera. At first we stood on the outskirts of the throng, but later Mohinder took us through to where Maharaji was standing on a mound. A steady stream of sevadars bearing full baskets from the dig site was flowing past like a river of earth on one side, and running back to the site with empty baskets on the other. All ranks and degrees were carrying the earth joyfully and singing, with adoring faces turned towards Maharaji as they did so. At one moment they tried to get close to him, slowly and slowly, edging their path higher and higher up the hill, until they were standing solidly around him, and had to be put in motion again at a reasonable height. Maharaji spared time to talk to us, and said it may take 2 years to complete the project, for seva could only be done with appreciable progress at the times of the big satsangs. But, he said, there was no need for hurry. He agreed to our attendance at tomorrow's conferring of initiation on a large number of applicants, and permitted us to take photographs and to sit silently, enjoying the great harmony of his darshan. He kept altering his position, looking at different groups quietly and with calm, loving eyes, which note everything. Today, with all those thousands at satsang, he told our shepherd, Mr. Khanna, "One of your people is missing," and noticed who took photos and many other small happenings that the ordinary eye would easily miss. For a long time he watched two women with a baby that one of them was nursing. This over, and the babe safely asleep, they confidently left it on a tiny ledge within Maharaj's view to return to their seva. A most touching example of faith and trust. No manpower is wasted during seva time. Taking care of everyone's shoes and extra clothing was an ancient blind woman, too feeble to traverse the rough terrain in safety. Another, an old granddad, was acting as a human keep left sign between the people with full baskets and the empties. They carry shallow baskets made of rough wicker on their heads, their knobbly surfaces insulated from the head by a donut made of rags, shaped like a decked tennis quoit. One man seemed determined to pay off as much karma as he could in one effort, and insisted on his basket being filled twice as full as anyone else's, running with it full speed to the dump. Yesterday we witnessed a perfect example of the Master's thoughtful grace. We had come back behind him through the dera towards his house on our way to our quarters. When we reached the lane before his gateway, our own way through was blocked by an eager crowd waiting for darshan. I remember thinking to myself, how are we going to get through? Without a moment's hesitation, he led us into the haven of his gateway for a few paces, and then, turning, paused to bid us a graceful Radha Soami, giving us the breathing space we needed until the crowd had dispersed from the lane. It was so beautifully and kindly done, and evoked our loving and silent thanks. 30th December. Today we witnessed the initiation instruction held in the big Satsang hall, which has a ground plan inside like the letter T, in the main stem of which sat the prospective candidates. All married couples, about 460 pairs. Maharaji sat in a chair before the dais area, and they filed past him, those who were accepted going to the right wing of the T, and those rejected, only about 5% this time, to the left and out of the hall. Each accepted candidate was given a card after they had been closely observed and briefly questioned by the Master. The accepted couples were divided, the women sitting on one side and men on the other. The Master then went out of the hall for a time, and the candidates were gathered closer around the dais, all the doors being locked and the upper galleries searched, for at initiations only satsangis may be present. The Master then came in again, and in a very deep, quiet, kindly voice, gave instructions along very similar lines to the present written directions given to overseas candidates by representatives abroad. When talking, he uses his hands to perfection with a great economy of gesture. As they are such beautiful hands, each gesture is completely expressive, full of love, purity, and beauty. After the instructions were given, Maharaji made the candidates repeat the names and regions 5 or 6 times each, and then went outside again for a time. Sevadars were then deputized, and repetition of the names and regions continued to be taught for about 15 minutes, when Maharaji returned and completed the instruction of the sound current, explaining the position for Simran and Dhyan, and the change for bhajan. We all took up the requisite position for bhajan, and meditated for about 20 minutes in his blessed company. The candidates were asked what they had heard, and Maharaji gave a final speech of blessing. There were no further activities today, as a second initiation took place in the evening, after the Master had again gone down to be present at Seva by the river, where a side road is being built in the form of a ramp from the main road. This will lead down to the river and be convenient for Sevadars on their way to cut reeds for fuel and for cremations. 31st December. Again today there was no satsang, with darshan for the Western visitors only for a few minutes. At Seva, a top dressing of soil was put on yesterday's road. A street of leasehold houses for the use of resident satsangis is being built, consisting of 1- and 2-room suites. Footnote: all accommodation is owned by the RSSB Society, and now given free for the use of Sevadars at the discretion of the master. Editor. End footnote. Owners are asked to agree that others may occupy the accommodation in their temporary absence. Captain Purushottam Singh, Shoti, the master's brother, took Mr. and Mrs. Shidlow and Ron for a drive to Baba Bakala, a nearby village, this evening. 1st January, 1962. A beautiful satsang was given this morning, at which Sardar Bahadur Jagat Singh's widow was present, a frail old lady held in great respect by all. During the course of his satsang, Maharaji drew our attention to the fact that in this life we not only languish under the ill effects of our bad karma, but we reap rewards for past good actions as well. Sometimes they may take the form of a charming disposition or good looks, which attract people to us. They may cause us to be born with a silver spoon in our mouth, having property, wealth, or temporal power. There may even be so great an accumulation of good karma as to entitle us to a protracted holiday in the allurements of a paradise in Trikuti, the highest heaven of the mind. All happiness on these planes tantalizes us with its elusive impermanence, for as soon as the effect of the good actions which caused it are exhausted, we either change within ourselves and tire of them, they cloy us with their sweetness, or else they are withdrawn, leaving us frustrated and embittered. In time, even their memory fades or is washed away by death. We are, therefore, said the Master, either C-class prisoners undergoing hard labor, or A-class prisoners on remission for good conduct. But in either case, we are inescapably prisoners. Someone approaching the path once said, "Why should we not seek to do good in this world, to improve conditions for the poor and follow a mission of relieving suffering? Surely this is a good attitude to adopt." Here, then, was the Master's answer. For however we seek to improve world conditions, we are only transforming C-class prisoners into A-class ones. We may be able to congratulate ourselves on the results, but have we stopped to consider how our own mind has been subconsciously and egotistically affected? The only way one can help the world is to subdue one's own mind, said Maharaji, and this may not be done by discipline alone. If one confines a viper in a basket, one only remains safe so long as the lid is shut, for the viper in the basket does not become a dove, just as a thorn bush, nurtured in a vineyard, does not bring forth grapes. Footnote. The Bible, Luke, chapter 6, verse 44. End footnote. Severe penances keep the mind under duress, but the first perfume of worldly allurement wafted past our nostrils immediately activates the very ego that we made such Herculean efforts to calm and extinguish. In the satsang, Maharaji went on to say, "It is only Nam or Shabad that effectively kills the ego. Nothing equals it for the purpose of knowing oneself and attaining God realization. Absolute, eternal, and real truth is the Shabad, and all other practices are inferior to it, for they keep us forever in delusion. Shabad alone pierces the dense clouds of Maya and pulls us up into the great daylight of eternity. It takes us into reality and grants us ineffable peace and bliss." Parshad was distributed after satsang to all, that of the Westerners being in little leaf cups skewered together with a twig. We had darshan afterwards, Maharaji asking after the health of one sick member, commenting on the beauty and warmth of the day, and asking for comparisons with our various countries: South Africa, Canada, America, Germany, and England. He bade us welcome to a New Year party at his house this afternoon at 4:30, and gave us each a signed portrait as a New Year card. Yesterday, the Himalayas were obscured by clouds, and today they have emerged capped with snow, floating dreamlike high above the plain. The air is unbelievably clear, and the sky looks as though it had been washed. It is quite hot in the afternoon, though really cold as soon as the sun sets and until it gains power in the morning. Yesterday was dull and chilly. We attended Maharajji's New Year party, which was held in a marquee in the garden between his new house and Dr. Johnson's Koti house. Maharajji and Harjit, his wife, bade us welcome at the entrance, and a buffet meal was laid out on tables. We ate first. The food arrangements were excellent, and the cooking superb, all Indian sweets and savories. Later, Harjit opened the entertainment, accompanying another Indian lady, Bibi Raleigh, who was an attendant in the household since Hazur Maharaj Sawan Singh Ji's time, singing and also playing a harmonium. Many Indians sang and recited, and all the Americans present gave a rendering of the pre-Satsang Shabad they sing in the USA. Dr. Randolph Stone, an American Satsangi, expressed the feelings of all Westerners when he said, in a short address, what a wonderful opportunity the people of this country had with Maharajji, so to speak, on their doorstep, whilst we have to come thousands of miles to see him, an opportunity not all of us have even then. While the party was in progress, a little owl flew in and around the tent, closer and closer above Maharajji's head. He gave it a single look, and having accomplished its mission, it flew out into the night. Rao Sahib Shivdyan Singh, Harjit's father, and Sardar Balwant Singh, in charge of land and agriculture at the Dera, took part in a joint act in which they recited some English doggerel which brought the house down. Later, Rao Sahib, that delightful old gentleman, with all the courtesy of a past age, said to Ron, "Pardon an old man's follies." Otto, a young German Satsangi, and Chachachi, a relative of the master's, had an eating contest. Maharajji, as always, was his most beautiful, graceful self, and yet enjoyed himself enormously. My husband presented him with 2 copies of the German translation of The Inner Voice, Die innere Stimme, which had been prepared in Europe, and an invitation to our next satsang in England, which caused some merriment. We also met Professor Janak Raj Puri, the brother of the author of Mysticism, The Spiritual Path. Earlier we had watched Miti Seva, Earth-Carrying Service. 2nd January. An initiation instruction of the women took place in the Satsangar, at which about 99% were accepted. We were bidden by the master to accompany him into the sunshine on the veranda outside, while the new initiates were being taught the names and regions by the Sevadars. There were only about 6 of us this time. We sat for a time on the master's cotton mat, Dori, whilst he reclined with his legs raised, seeming very tired. We all felt he ought to be alone, but were reluctant to suggest it. There was an archway over our heads in which the wild bees had built their combs, and they were flying around us rather alarmingly. At first, Maharajji suggested that they would not harm us if we did not seek to drive them away. Bee-flies, he called them. Some of us were still nervous, however, and so he kindly suggested we move away onto another dory. This indirectly provided him with the rest and withdrawal we thought he should be having. Later, Margaret and I walked to the lone tree some distance upriver from the Dera, under which Dr. Johnson is said to have passed many hours in meditation when he was alive. We went over the sands and through the reeds by the river and up to the tree, through one of the enormous clefts made in the clay soil by rivulets draining the surrounding higher countryside and running down into the river. We had a strenuous walk back, a miniature mountaineering expedition, by keeping further inland across the lie of the clefts, which are in some cases 30 or 40 feet deep. Some of our number inadvertently got inveigled by an Indian Satsangi into a 30-mile car ride to Amritsar, and their absence caused some anxiety. It drew our attention to the fact that we were not supposed to leave the precincts of the Dara without Maharaj's knowledge. Later, without any knowledge of their absence, he told us that we should always inform him of our intentions of going out anywhere, as he is personally responsible to the Indian government for our safety. 3rd January. Today we had satsang with the master quietly sitting whilst a pati recited a shabad and gave the discourse. Maharaji, beautiful and statuesque, sat there looking lovingly at us all, full of grace and truth. We had the customary satsang for Westerners in his garden after that, and a particularly good English translation of the Bandara discourse was read to us by Mr. Khanna. I asked that a tape of it be given to the overseas satsangis, and Maharaji said he would try and make a synopsis of it for us, as it was very long. It was quite the most beautiful so far that I have heard, strong in parts, but most moving and poetic. Some good questions were then asked. Mrs. Jepp, affectionately known as Jeppy, asked if a soul for some reason had to undergo rebirth in a lower form, after having been a human being, would it have to go down to the bottom of the life cycle and begin again? Maharaji said that this might not be necessary. Souls were incarnated in bodies according to the karma of their past lives, and the desires they had projected during these periods. If, asked Jeppy, one had not completed one's repayment of karma after initiation in this life, and one had no desire to come back to this world, but was permitted to remain in one of the upper regions to work it out, would one create new karma whilst in these upper regions? The master again replied in the negative, and said one would be repaying one's karma by doing bhajan. And even though there is no other activity there, this would take longer than if expiated on earth. 5th January. The days are slipping by so quickly. In these last 3 days we have been allowed to do seva, all of us, carrying earth for the new road. It is wonderful how exhilarating this is, with Maharaji's eyes on us. Mohinder explained that this type of seva was considered to be the quickest way of subduing the ego. For no matter how high one is on the social scale, or in one's own estimation, the carrying of earth on one's head, or the covering of one's person with dust, as such work entails, reduces one's sense of self-importance. A little girl has adopted Alex McCaskill, and every day at seva she holds onto his hand and trots up and down with him, each of them with baskets on their heads, her basket a miniature edition of his. Her name is Savitri Devi, and she is about 6 or 7 years of age, a young woman of great firmness of character, who directs him to positions calculated to get a full basket most quickly, and issues clear instructions as to just how much his basket is to be filled. Great was my joy when told by the master today that if my passport arrangements could be completed satisfactorily, I might stay on for 2 or 3 months, and that Ran would be cared for, going back alone. At morning satsang for Westerners, Maharaji spoke most inspiringly the other day. The conversation had become general and on a rather mundane level. We were talking of the crowded state of the Western world, and Maharaji slowly and very delicately turned the conversation round to more spiritual levels. He said that perhaps the only understanding the world could know could be brought about by a common language. He seemed to indicate that a particular nation's language might not be acceptable, but an international tongue like Esperanto might meet the case. But then there seemed no impetus for nations to promote and to learn it. Only on spiritual levels could we become one big family. Look, he said, how all nations meet in Beas in an utterly friendly way, like one large family, with such mutual love. A helpful question raised by Claude Lovelace was, how should we answer people who casually inquired into our way of life and Sant Mat? Maharaji said we should not hurt people's religious susceptibilities. Sant Mat is not another religion to enter into competition with those already existing. Its way should be a positive one, not decrying other religions, but being capable of standing on its own feet and appealing to people by giving them something outstandingly pure and sweet, so that they were attracted to it without any sense of comparison. The attraction then would be automatic. During the conversation about nationalism, Maharaji, spilling over with laughter, told us how he had brought a Siamese dress home for Harjeet to wear. He described it as being long and straight, with a slit up the side, and he said, I suggested laughingly to her that she should wear it and just try it a little, but she said no. She refused point blank. At Harjeet's invitation, I had the honor of cooking Maharaji's lunch, assisted very kindly by Jeppy. We were told he enjoyed his meal, especially the main course, about which I had some trepidation. When we came back from Satsang behind him today to his own garden, I got a curious feeling whilst keeping my eyes on his person walking ahead. One had no sense of a personality trying to express itself whilst walking, as invariably happens in one sense or another with anyone else. There was such a sense of joy and grace, of quiet dignity, barely expressed by an outside body, like a beautiful being enclosed in light, wearing his body lightly, as it were. All of us following behind, going so lightly, I felt, and easily, as though we were treading air. Even when we fell behind a little or drew nearer to him, it was as though a spiritual thread of elastic attached each one of us to him, and it stretched or shrank accommodatingly with the change of distance, making nonsense of any future parting from him in time or space. 6th January. I felt this same connection with him again this morning, in another way. We had collected for his darshan in his garden, early, before setting forth on a day-long trip to Jandiala, Gurchetan's village. Only the British group was to go, English and Indian, at Maharaji's behest. After bidding him good morning and asking for his blessing on our journey, we gave and each received a loving Radha Soami in his cherishing voice, which makes each one feel like a specially beloved child getting his blessing. Though leave-taking had been completed, we all stood around as though by common consent, saying nothing, but very loath to leave his dear presence. I said, "And now we feel we don't want to leave you." We all laughed. The feeling was so spontaneously mutual and beyond human words in intercommunion. The journey to the village was made in 2 cars, Maharaji's jeep and a borrowed car. It was a day of the gods, as almost every day seems to be here, fair weather, clear, smiling, and sunny. We were given a spontaneously joyful welcome at Jandiala, and met, first of all, Gurchetan's sons and other relatives, and the father of Maharaj Singh, one of our other Indian satsangis in London. He resembled Mohan as he might be in years to come. They led us in a procession of villagers, simple and unaffected in their delightful welcome, to Gurchetan's house, where we were met, and the women amongst us were embraced by his handsome wife and daughter. We climbed to the rooftop, where, on its flat surface, we were regaled with a sumptuous Indian meal, served on a long table under an awning with canvas screens around us, all colorfully patterned. Even so, an eager, curious crowd of young women and children peered at us, quite inoffensively, from nearby rooftops. Shrieks of mirth and giggling broke out when we turned and noticed them, and this precipitated flight when cameras were turned on them at first. But later, photos were taken with much good humor and friendly chaffing. The whole occasion was one of such open-hearted love and pleasure on both sides. After lunch, we were conducted around the village by eager crowds, children, dogs, and poultry, all agog since they had not seen a white face for 30 years, but still with the same good humor and loving dignity as we felt the Queen might be given on a royal tour. Suddenly, we were embraced in the street by a dear little person who turned out to be Mohan Singh's wife, a charming little lady who took us into her small but very clean house. We sat in rows on 2 beds, and the whole village populace seemed to be pressing in at the door and filling the anteroom. She bade them open a side door for air, and the crowd was waiting courteously silent, but as eagerly, at that entrance too. I got such a strong impression, and others felt it too, of a biblical scene, as when the room being too crowded, they let the man, sick of the palsy, down through the roof for Christ to see. But our Savior was not with us in person this time. In fact, the rural simplicity and atmosphere all around was very reminiscent of scenes described in the Bible. We went back for tea on the roof, another tastefully cooked and served meal, and met many people, some non-satsangis, all seemingly searching and ready. One Sikh gentleman, a retired Indian Army captain, appeared very near the truth. We had such a feeling of perhaps being path-straighteners, and to our joy heard that Maharaji intends holding satsang at the village on 29th January, later confirmed by his own lips to Gurchetan. Gurchetan is reported as having answered the master's enquiry as to when he was proposing to go back to England by saying, "Not Maharaji until your honor deigns to visit my village." We again had a loving darshan of the master on our return. He was interviewing other people on one of the house lawns when we came, and the siren went for evening bhajan while we waited. We sat and did our simran, getting all the benefit that such an environment created in us. When he came to us, with gentle humility, Maharaji begged our pardon for keeping us waiting. God's most perfect emissary on earth, begging our pardon for permitting us to do Simran in his house. Dr. Schmidt, an initiate of Maharaj Sawan Singh ji, had arrived by air from Switzerland whilst we were in Jandiala. 7th January. Dr. Schmidt asked if I would help him type and translate his impressions of initiation. Maharaji had apparently recommended that I assist him in this capacity. 10th January. The last 3 days have been spent mainly in organizing the committee work for the British Sangat. Mr. Alawalia, the Dara secretary, formulated a very able solution, which, however, Maharaji apparently did not consider entirely fitting, so he is going to tell us his plans tomorrow. It is bound to be a masterly concept and solve all our problems. Mr. Ahluwalia read us some of his translation of a Shabad by Maharaj Sawan Singh from his book Gurmat Siddhant, now translated and known as Philosophy of the Masters. It was so inspiring that it made us immediately wish to sit in bhajan. We understand it is soon to be published, along with an abridged edition of The Path of the Masters and 4 other books. At one of the morning sessions, Maharaji approved of our proposed pamphlet on the introduction to vegetarian cookery for new satsangis and seekers, and said we may reproduce it and print leaflets of basic recipes as suggested in it. From the way Mr. Ahluwalia spoke of book production, we realized with what careful discrimination they handle any matter connected with printing. One can fully understand this when one considers what a potent instrument for good or ill the printed word can be. In the wrong hands, it could lead more surely than most other ways to the reduction of a living philosophy to a dead religion. All manuscripts are therefore meticulously referred to the master for his approval before going to press. This morning after Western Satsang, Maharaji gave us his proposals for the running of the British Sangat, spoken spontaneously with no written notes. He began to outline the constitution of the committee and its duties, and as spokesman I took notes whilst listening, and quickly made a little tree, asking him to verify its structure. He was kind enough to use it, and to ask me to draw up a draft of what he had told us, for use as an indication, no doubt, that we had understood what he wished done, and for Mr. Ahluwalia's guidance in typing a fair directive. He asked me if I were satisfied, and said that I could express any opinion quite freely as to its suitability. I said that, in my humble opinion, it was a perfect arrangement which only he could have devised. Mr. Ahluwalia had previously told us that the Dara is contemplating printing, in 3 languages, a periodical like our Sant Mat magazine in the UK, Spiritual Link, the layout of which they greatly admired. It might be a good idea to make maps of A. London and environs, showing the relative positions of local groups, and B. England, showing central and local groups. Maharaji was very interested in the numerical strengths of groups and their relative contiguity, also the distances between provincial groups and London. He suggested the names of 5 out of 6 of the personnel of the main committee and all the British group, and 2 out of 5 of the Indian group, leaving the choice of the remainder to each president. He said small local committees should have 1 person as their head, chosen by mutual consent between themselves. He laid great stress on the fact that all committee members should think of themselves equally as Sevadars. All decisions should be taken to further the quality and quantity of the individual's bhajan only. Committees, British, Indian, and local, were given wide powers of self-determination within their own scope. When holding satsang, Maharaji said, people could read or sing shabads, ask or answer questions, read from recognized Sant Mat literature, or give talks and discourses on aspects of Radha Soami. But group meditation was not permitted. Satsang could be held by as few as 2 people. All seemed very content with the master's proposals. In consultation with B. Jauncey, Gurchetan, Mr. Career, and Ron, I prepared the directive and talked the draft over with Mr. Ahluwalia afterwards. Again the next day, I also further consulted Maharaji in a private session on points of doubt. At the open meeting, Maharaji had stressed that honest differences of opinion could be referred directly to him, provided they were of an important enough nature. Where such differences affected the executive running of the Sangat, however, presidents should be kept in the picture. At the satsang immediately preceding the meeting, I asked the master to recapitulate one's method of collecting the attention at the third eye. He described how the 9 doors should be closed, and the attention taken upwards, with a progressive loss of sensation from the feet upwards, and a feeling of pull at the tisra til. Dr. Schmidt asked if this were situated 3 inches behind the forehead in the pineal gland. Maharaji responded that one could not tie it down to an exact anatomical position. It has a mental and spiritual existence, and not a physical one. One should not try to imagine it being in a certain spot between the eyes, nor turn the physical eyes backward and inward in one's effort at concentration. If one concentrates on the spot mentally, finally one's limited consciousness will cease to exist, and will then encompass the whole of creation.